Hello, everyone. I'm Jenna Paone. Welcome to Lit Chick on a Mighty Blaze. I'm so thrilled to welcome Virginia Hume here today to celebrate her debut novel, Haven Point. Virginia, welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. I thank you so much for having me. Look, I have it here too.
Yes, we're so thrilled. This is so great. Virginia is taking time on her daughter's birthday to be here with us today. So thank you for being here, and happy birthday to your daughter. Before we get rolling on some questions, I just want to introduce you briefly to anyone who might not know you, and then we'll jump in and talk about the book. Virginia Hume is a freelance writer and editor. She came to fiction writing after a long series of professional adventures, which ranged from spokeswoman for a national political party to editor of an underground newspaper to speechwriter for the publisher of a major daily newspaper to actor to podcast host. But she spent the bulk of her early career working in politics and public affairs before writing and releasing her debut novel, Haven Point. She is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and lives outside Washington, D.C. with her husband, their daughters, and an undergroomed Bichon named Chester, where she's hard at work on her next novel. Her debut novel, Haven Point, is an instant national bestseller. Booklist says fans of Ellen Hildebrand and Beatrice Williams will appreciate this sweeping, multi-generational family story. Pop Sugar calls it the book equivalent of a beach getaway. Book Riot calls it a stunning debut. And our good friend, nationally best-selling author Jamie Brenner says Haven Point checks all the boxes for a great summer read. Generations of strong women, an idyllic but insular coastal town, and an emotionally rich story that explores the peaks and valleys of life in all its complicated glory. The Demarest family will stay with you long after their final secrets have been revealed. Welcome, Virginia, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much.
And I have to ask, is it Demarest or Demarest?
Demarest.
Demarest. There we go. All right. Yeah.
I got a lot of people ask that.
I knew whichever way I said it was going to be the wrong way, obviously.
Well, is it really wrong? I mean, these are written words. Like, we can interpret them however we want. So I suppose you can pronounce it however you want to pronounce it. I pronounce it Demarest, but hey, it's reader interpretations are always welcome.
I love it. I like to hear it from the authors, the author's mouth themselves, though, because it gives you the sense of what they were thinking when they were writing it. So let's just start off. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Haven Point, and what inspired you to write it? Just give us kind of the elevator pitch. We never do spoilers here. Just a little overall what the story is about.
Sure. So Haven Point is a multi-generational family saga. It's about 3 generations of women in the Demarest family, or Demarest, truly. I don't mind. Whatever you want. Marin, her daughter Anne, and Anne's daughter Sky. Yep. All 3 of whom have in different times and for different reasons, kind of a fraught relationship with this very insular summer community on the Maine coast where the Demarest since the late 19th century have had a home. It's called Haven Point. Surprise.
Haven Point, the title of the book.
Yeah, exactly. And Marin eventually makes her peace with the community, but at the end of the summer of 1970, her daughter Anne leaves, vowing never to return. And she keeps that promise until her untimely death, so about 38 years later. Anne's daughter Sky, who's in Washington, D.C., kind of shares her mother's perspective on the place. Since her mom didn't go there, she was only occasionally there with her grandparents and never really felt like she was in the swim. But it turns out there are things that Sky didn't know about what was behind her mother's antipathy to Haven Point. And that sort of drives the narrative. I think thematically speaking, the story's told between 2 interwoven narratives, Marin grandmother and Sky granddaughter. And the prologue, which is in the novel's present day, is 6 months after Anne has died. So you're never in Anne's head. And these 2 narratives really kind of paint different pictures of young Annie Demarest. From Marin's perspective, we see as very charismatic and artistic, creative, impulsive, attractive, and mostly joyful as a child. And then Sky, through her perspective, we see many of those same characteristics, but also someone who has a problem with addiction, which I'm not giving much away because that's really in the first chapter.
Yep.
All those things, but a lot more troubled. And I think the question the reader has is, what am I missing? And that question, what am I missing, is really thematically important. I think it's a question all of us should be asking all the time when we're tempted to judge. What is it that I don't know? And And it also is sort of the small M mystery, as I said, that drives the narrative, is the answer to that question.
I love it. Exactly. It's exactly the type of like juicy, like multi-layered read that is such a great book, you know, to read in the summer or in the fall in a coastal setting, or when you will feel like you want to be in a coastal setting, but you might not want to be in a coastal setting. We have to talk about Haven Point, because I mean, number one, I want to move there immediately. I think maybe not everybody would have that reaction. I think some people would go, "Oh no, I don't want to be part of this community." But it sounds great to me. it sounds super fun. It's a complex place. It is a flawed place. It is, you know, a place that is elitist, but also welcoming in some ways, but it very exclusionary in a lot of ways. It's very homogeneous. It's very, you know, perhaps not the most diverse place. I have to imagine, because the whole book is about the relationship of these women to this place. Did the book start with Haven Point? Did you start with the setting? And do you think of yourself kind of as a setting oriented author? And if so, like, what can you tell us a little bit about the process of kind of conceiving this place? Like, was it inspired by a real place? Was it inspired, you know, by somewhere you visited maybe? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
That's such a good question. You know, when I was first working on my first draft of Haven Point, I would occasionally listen to interviews like this one with authors, and they would be asked about their inspiration, and they always had these really super lofty answers, you know, like some character that just like emerged fully formed in a dream, or some theme like, you know, envy in a postmodern late stage capitalist whatever. I remember thinking, am I doing this wrong? Because I started with a place. Haven Point is not a real place. It's a composite. My very earliest summers were spent on my grandfather's house on Old Black Point, which is a little summer colony similar to Haven Point on the Connecticut shore. And he sold that house when I was really young. And I remember when I was looking at colleges, I went to look at Connecticut College, which is not far from there. And my mom and I went and looked at the house. And I was like completely heartbroken because I knew that I'd had these summers at this place that was all these things. And I think, you know, it's so interesting, Jenna, that you talk about how going back and forth between the positive and the negative about Haven Point, because this is always true. You know, it's like so many things can be true, as Marin says late in the novel at one time, and we get a story in our head about a place. And I had that. I had a lot of, I was a joiner. It sounds like you might be too. Like I like community.
I like community too. That's what appeals to me about this.
I think, well, you know, you're involved in A Mighty Blaze, and I think, you know, that's obviously a wonderful community that emerged at a time when people really needed it. I was the sleepaway camp kid. I mean, my family, it was like kind of a refrain in my family. They'd be like, "You're such a joiner." Like that was a little weird. But we were vagabonds in the summer, and I can remember coming back, especially around like early adolescence. And the kids who went, it didn't matter where it was. You know, I had no concept about whether someplace was elite or, you know, it didn't matter. It could be like tiny little shacks and, you know, somewhere in the Poconos by a dirty pond. If people went back to the same place summer after summer, then that to me was, I just romanticized it so much. And of course, that's a romantic story too. You know, this idea that if you go to some summer community like that you have the Good Housekeeping seal of belonging forever. Because we all bring our whole selves wherever we go. We bring our whole humanity wherever we go. And, but I do think just like small towns and, you know, universities or boarding schools or any insular community where you're throwing the same people together really do make great settings for novels. And they can, as I think Haven Point does, become kind of a character in their own right. So I started with setting, and you know, my answer to my own question, am I doing this wrong? I think ultimately was, yes, I'm writing about a community, but I'm also writing about community, or the idea, and a really essential ingredient in community, which is forgiveness.
Yeah. I love that. Oh, I mean, it's so timely, especially now. I mean, we live in such, fraught times. This was a question I was going to ask you later, but I think you kind of naturally segued into it of, as you mentioned Marin's quote, and I'm going to find it here that I have about how, as you said, that many things can be true at the same time. And I think we live in a time where complexity is very much discarded, and the idea of, of black and white and right and wrong. And certainly that does exist, but I find that we're aiming toward the simplistic. I don't know if it's because of social media and how we're all looking for sound bites and tweets and things that kind of distill things down into simple, easy answers. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm good, you're bad. What I love about this book is that you really embrace the complexity of both individuals being, no one character in this book is completely good or completely bad, as they shouldn't be. And this community is not completely good and not completely bad. And in fact, a lot of this book is about these women confronting their own assumptions or expectations about their neighbors and vice versa. Was it cathartic for you to write this book during this time? It sounds like you started it a while ago. So was that an intention was that like an intention when you set out to write it, or did that evolve over time? That idea, like that, I feel like your book is all about embracing complexity and embracing the gray areas. Was that clear to you from the outset, or was that something that evolved over the process?
That's a really good question. I mean, I do think that this springs a little bit from how I try to live in the world, that I try, I worked in politics, but it was such a different era. I worked at bipartisan firms for 13 years. I always assumed I have friends all across the political spectrum, and, I might not agree with them often. But I still think they're good people. And it's been really, really distressing to me in recent years just to see what's happened to discourse. And but that definitely is a theme that emerged. I feel like in some ways thematically, first of all, I sold the novel actually in spring of 2019.
Okay.
So before COVID. But it was April. So bringing it out in 2020 would have been a little tight because it's usually about 18 months or so. And as it turned out, it was best that it didn't come out anyway. But also my editor at St. Martin's, when she was talking to me before I got the contract, she was like bracing herself when she had to tell me that it would be 2 years before it came out. And I was like, yeah, whatever. So long to write it, it was a side hustle for so long that I was like, I never really counted on, you don't know, like, you really have to hedge your bets in life when you're a writer, because you don't know if you'll sell it. So I already had it done when COVID came along, and it's good that it didn't come out when COVID, during 2020, even though we're still in COVID. You really picked up, I think, on the theme that it really did, Jenna, emerge over time. This idea of the concept of narrative identity, the way that we as individuals and communities see ourselves. And these, we all have stories we tell ourselves, and they're so often unconscious. And that's really necessary. Like our conscious brains can't handle that much. Like when you're sitting at a traffic light, like you don't need to absorb the colors of the cars next to you, or like the normal hum of traffic. Like our subconscious does so much work sorting through and seeking patterns. So our subconscious mind will like kick up to our conscious mind what we need to know, which is like, the lights just turned green, but there's this car coming, perpendicular that's going too fast. Our conscious mind will say, this doesn't fit the right pattern. Notice this, so you don't pull into the intersection and get broadsided. But I think these shortcuts can be so dangerous. And I don't think I really tried, although people have observed after reading Haven Point that there's characters aren't always obviously good or bad. There's one in particular, without giving any spoilers away, Finn Donnelly, who is sort of an outsider in this community. And I think the convention is that if someone's excluded, that they wear the white hat and the excluders wear the black hat. And well, that's true to an extent. But it's not, that's almost never the whole truth. I think we struggle so much these days, with this issue in terms of our political discourse, as you indicated. But what I also grappled with in a similar vein is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and sort of the insider outsider perspectives we can have. So Skye has a story about herself and about Haven Point. Haven Point is shiny, perfect people. And everybody's happy. And she says about this guy who's sort of a creature of Haven Point, someone who grew up there at one point. She says, out to dinner with them, and she says, like, easy laugh, easy life. She just thinks everything's been perfect for him. And everyone there, it's all been easy. And I think that's because she was really plagued by shame. She had a very difficult, unusual, kind of unconventional life with her single mother and sperm donor, art of insemination clinic father and art teacher mom and changing schools all the time. And she just thought she didn't fit in. She was really blinded by shame. And I think shame and fear and pride and grief can really alter our narratives, how we see ourselves. And Haven Point also has a narrative about itself, which I think is analogous to how some people, when they get really anxious about immigration, however you feel about that issue, there's certainly people whose minds go straight to a really dark place when they think about immigrants. It's like, oh, Katie barred the door, our whole culture will change. Or even when someone new moves into the neighborhood,
someone new in the neighborhood. And that's the thing that's so great about this book is it takes something very personal that everyone can relate to. Even if you don't live on an idyllic coastal community in Maine, we all, have a neighborhood in some way, shape, or form, if it's whatever that community and whatever that neighborhood be. And I do think there's the tendency of people to look at other communities and say, well, that looks perfect, or that looks, way different than what I want it to look. It's great. I love the embracement of, I love how you embrace complexity. That, I think is the single biggest issue with the world today is that people don't understand how to think, about complicated subjects, and that there's always going to be a gray area, and very, very infrequently is there an easy answer. However, that being said, we'll move on from the political discourse and all the serious talk. Let's talk a little more about your journey to publication. So you said, I want to know, it sounds like it took a while, and that you were a very successful in your career in communications and politics and marketing and public affairs. When did you start writing the book? And can you tell us a little bit about what that journey was like? It went from side hustle to this is, something you're going to do. I love to hear about people's journeys and that moment of when they were like, yeah, I'm going to do this. Please tell us a little bit.
So I almost hate to answer this question totally honestly, because I don't want to be discouraging, because I don't think the journey has to take quite as long as it did with me. This is partly circumstantial, but I really started writing this in 2012. And so it came out 9 years later. And if you told me that at the time, I'd be like, well, that's just stupid. I'm absolutely not going to, like, why would I do that? But it took me about 1.5 years to have a draft. And I was working on my own. I had gone out on my own like a couple years before that. But I had a lot of clients and a lot of work, and sometimes it's sort of like the ebbs and flows and seasons. And so I just worked on it when I could, and then I sent it to a bunch of readers. So just some smart friends who I know read sort of upmarket women's fiction. I have a friend, Christina Beechler, who's an absolutely brilliant poet, who read for me, and a few others. And I got their feedback, and I worked that in. And then I have a friend who works at a literary agency. She's not an agent. She's an attorney, but she works with the literary group. And she's always saying, if you have a manuscript, send it to me. And I did. And it sat there for 9 months. But it coincided with this is just an example of things that happened along this journey that made it. That's why it took so long. I could have rattled the cages. I mean, what happened was someone liked it. I mean, this is someone who was, I'm sure, very junior, but kicked it upstairs, and then someone had a baby and went on maternity leave, and it went somewhere else. And they said no in the end. And I don't know why, maybe it's like my age, or I have friends who've worked in Hollywood or in various places, but I know most people say no. I mean, I was just fully prepared for that.
Yeah.
I had just kind of thought maybe I'd get some useful feedback. I wouldn't say the feedback, partly because it had been in so many different hands, it was a little like internally inconsistent.
Yeah.
And then I went back in, I'd left it fallow. It's always good to like leave your manuscript for a while. Went back in myself. At one point, I did have an outside editor who knew, like an independent editor who knew the commercial market. Because things change a lot. And that doesn't mean you have to do whatever the market demands. This is just suggestions. And if they resonate with you as an author and make a book more marketable, then, why not?
Right.
So she was great. Took me forever to do those. And then I guess I got an agent in 2018. I did have help getting an agent. So this was nice. This is a nice to have. It's not a must have, but I have a friend who works in marketing and publicity. And she just really liked the manuscript. And it's not like helping, like doing sort of literary consultancy is not the core of what she does. But she agreed, and to sort of get it in front of some agents because she knows everyone. She's like my age.
Yeah.
We're older. So that was great. And of course, the first ones come back these really big agents. But I find they were such an encouraging no's.
Yeah, great.
Encouraging
no is sometimes a really great thing. Right? I mean, and like an encouraging no, a no with like notes, or like a no with like, hey, maybe this would be better for this person. Like that's an encouraging no, and that happens all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so then I wound up having interest from 2 agents, but what I picked up from those encouraging no's was that it still needed something. And to be honest, I didn't know what it was. My outside editor didn't know. None of my readers did. So I wound up going with Susanna Einstein, my agent, had some good ideas. And I think those helped me sort of implementing her suggestions, helped get the manuscript self-evidently where it needed to be, because once we made those, we sold it. And then my editor at St. Martin's had a major restructuring suggestion that is, in hindsight, so just absolutely incandescently obvious. I can't believe that anyone can. Pardon? A wedding tour got comfort. Sorry. Okay. So I'm in a room at
You're in an inn, right?
I'm in an inn, and a wedding group is about to come through. So this was unexpected. They're just taking a look. So hopefully, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Hey, guys, can we keep going? Are you cool?
Yes, we can. Most certainly. So Sarah Canton is the only person at St. Martin's Press who suggested what she suggested, which is, I originally wrote Haven Point, where you met Skye, the younger of the 2 narratives, as a grown-up. And her childhood was sort of tucked into memories. And Marin's narrative is really the story of her whole marriage. And the way I originally wrote it, Skye was listening to that whole story. In the beginning. And the way it's written now, you meet Skye when she's young, and Sarah's like, she doesn't need to hear this whole story about her grandmother's entire life. I mean, it made sense that she did, but it made just as much sense that she didn't. There was only this one part. And I think also this idea of 2 dual narratives that come together kind of late in the novel is a construct that people have gotten more accustomed to in recent years. I don't think in 2012 that I had read as many novels like that as I have.
And I think these types of books, specifically the upmarket women's fiction, this kind of like setting oriented beach setting coastal book really lends itself to that, because they're places where you have these big generations and like stories that need to be told that never get told. I was interested. It's interesting to hear you talk about the structure, because I was wondering, because you alternate between Marin and Skye, but you don't always, like, sometimes there's like 2 Marin chapters and then a Skye chapter, or like, and we bounce back and forth through time. You know, like you said, you now start with like Sky's childhood, like our first chapter is, and it doesn't go sequentially, then it jumps to when she's an adult.
Right.
And sometimes we have like other, you know, we jump around in time. Sometimes we're, you know, so was all of that, which I love. And I love hearing that was a late change, that like, because I like to remind people who are writers who are watching that, like, your book as it exists, as you write it, is not necessarily the way people will read it. Did you always, so when you started, did you start with like Marin and write her whole story first and then write Annie and Sky's story? Or did you start writing it as basically as it's read? Like, did you start, you know, in the future and then going back?
So oh my God, I don't remember. I honestly God don't remember.
Been a while, right?
I think I wrote it more chronologically. So I think I started with, so there used to be a section, like a whole section from the 1890s. So that's now,
which is
now
going
to be, who's read the book is going to be like, what? That would not fit in at all. And well, indeed it did not. And so that will be in the next book. So
yes. Oh, I love it.
I did. I might have actually, you know what? I wrote Sky's first chapter first.
Yep.
And then I wrote it, actually, now I'm remembering. I wrote Sky was an adult. She comes to Haven Point and she hears the story. And then the way I originally wrote it, you continue to go back to Sky, but she's hearing the whole story. So it was always alternating. And I think one thing that was tricky about Haven Point versus some other novels that have more than one interwoven narrative is that Marin's narrative's like 60% and change, like maybe 65% of the story, and Sky's is like 35%. Now, there's a reason for that, because these two stories are pulling together a picture of Annie Demarest, who's the
really Annie's story in a lot of ways.
Right. And Marin's begins because all of our stories begin before we're born. You know, our stories begin with our parents' marriage and their own histories. And so hers is necessarily longer. And then you meet Sky, she's 13. So I picked that because I thought about writing a chapter beginning with her younger, and I realized children don't have thoughts that this is written in third person. Thoughts aren't mature enough. They don't construct. I mean, I find it sometimes when writers try to write young characters in third person close that it's not credible, because you don't really you don't think of the world the way that you need to communicate. So I felt like I had to tuck still some of Sky's younger childhood into her chapters, but the challenge with having these sort of this uneven weighting of these two narratives, even though I think it makes absolute sense with the story, is that it's harder to sympathize with Sky because you don't spend as much time with her, and meeting her in her youth and living with her through those experiences versus through exposition and memories, flashbacks, I think was a much better way to have the reader sympathize with the character you're spending less time with, but who matters in some very important ways. So Sarah was right. She knew instantly what this needed. And I remember my first conversation with her saying, wow, it must be so great to read novels and know exactly what they need. Said, well, I don't always, like this novel could have, there was another publisher interested, like it could have come out and with someone else and not been as good a story maybe. So I'm very grateful. I had a lot of great advice along the way, and I, encourage authors always, or aspiring authors, to seek it and be willing to listen, but also be willing to not agree with everything. I had a friend of mine whose sister's a literary agent. She only does nonfiction now, but and she'd written a couple books, and when I told her I worked with this outside independent editor and was implementing, she said, well, how many of her suggestions? And I was like, how many? And she's like, well, like what percent? I was like, I would say 65% of her suggestions I'm taking. She's like, that's perfect.
That's great.
How do you know? Like, it just means that you have the humility, but you also are not just blowing with every wind.
Yes.
taking.
You have to know your own story, and you also have to be able to be flexible to change the story and humble enough to change the story when it's going to serve the story. And I do think you get that gut instinct of like, yes, this is the right thing, even if you didn't come up with it. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about, so Haven Point follows 4 generations of women in this family over the course of 7 decades, beginning with World War II. So that's a lot of history to cover and a lot of research to do. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? How did it work? It sounded like you started even further back. So like, were you somebody who read a bunch of books up front and then wrote the book, or did you kind of read as you go? Tell us a little bit about the, how you took the research process and how that went.
So research, of course, I think a lot of writers, Haven Point is not historical fiction. I mean, technically it's upmarket women's fiction with historical and romantic elements. So it's not genre.
Oh, I love it.
Genre romance. Like, that's that shelf at Barnes and Noble.
I love it. Honestly, that's my own book. That exact sentence has come out of my mouth before.
It is a mouthful, but so I know it can be tricky. Like, it's very easy to overread. When I worked in public affairs, we had a client, and it was a coalition of the top research universities. This is obviously scientific research. And the issue that they care about in Washington is we have like a partnership with our federal government and universities. So we fund basic research, which is like science for science's sake, like just for discovery, which is different from applied research. Applied research is like when a pharmaceutical company takes that research and uses it to come up with this drug that they sell or whatever. There's a million examples, not just, in medicine. So I sort of divided my time between basic research, which is just reading up on World War II in Washington, D.C., because you can get ideas for your story from the research. You're like, oh, I can really use that. And applied research, which is answering a specific question. What would she be wearing? What did they do? There's a lot of the Marin's story and how she first meets her husband, Oliver Demarest, is she's a cadet nurse at Walter Reed. And I chose that because it worked with her age. And they have an age difference. And it made sense for how old I envisioned her being when she meets him. So you're kind of doing a combination of those things. I think I'm pretty good at finding the evidence, or finding sort of the nugget you need to find. But I do also enjoy just reading generally. I just think you can waste a lot of time, though. I mean, unless you just love it so much, but you can waste a lot of time just going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. And I would do that even on these applied research questions. I'd be like, fashion. I'd be looking at like 7,000 websites about like 1940s, like World War II women's fashion. Like, just pick something. That's really unnecessary.
Because you don't have to describe the exact neckline. You just sort of say like, okay, it's a square neckline with the, the blue dress with the square neckline with the belt. Like now, like that's stuck in my head of like an actual outfit. Like I have a very clear image in my head of what that dress looks like based on, as a reader, like you can leave part of the joy of reading, especially a book that, it delves into parts of time where I was not alive, is like imagining that, and imagining what it is. And you don't want to take away the joy of the reader of giving them too many details. That's something I think
that's a really good point. I think it's also, that's the kind of stuff that so often ends up on the cutting room floor because you're so tempted to overdo it. And I was pretty conscious of that, but considering as I told you, there was a whole section set in the Gilded Age. That obviously I still overdid it.
I love it. Well, I mean, you have so much ground to cover. And one thing I think you do really well, I mean, you start off in World War II, which is like, but it's not a World War II book. And I think that's a really hard thing to do because World War II is such an overwhelming historical event. It's such an overwhelming time. but you move through the decades in a way that like the world outside happens and certain things affect the characters' lives, and certainly Annie is a product of her time, and like the incident that sends her away happening in the 70s makes kind of perfect sense for like the climate outside. But you just do a really good job of balancing that, because obviously, I mean, current timing aside, usually historical events don't affect us in a way that something like the pandemic does, like every aspect of our lives. And World War II was maybe the last time in history when that happened in a way that it affected like everyone in the world in this like huge, giant way. But this all feels very true to life. It's something happening outside that affects the characters. Was that a hard balance for you to achieve as a writer? Is it something you actively worked on, or kind of something that came naturally to you?
You know, I would say I joke that I use the IKEA method for writing Haven Point, which is that the same way I put together furniture from IKEA, which is not reading any of the instructions and doing it wrong, and then being like, yet another Billy bookcase that I've got the back on wrong. I've done 20 Billy bookcases and then fixing it, like figuring out what's wrong. And so I would say I did this very imperfectly at first, but I had some sense, I think, just having absorbed enough of the conventions from reading so many novels, I would know something wasn't working. And that issue of how much time to allow to pass between chapters, because you don't want to slow. My interpretation of upmarket fiction is that, for any viewers who don't know the term, like that's, again, not a shelf at Barnes & Noble, but it's, this space between commercial and literary. So you use the things you learned in English class, metaphors and showing and not telling, but you also, I think upmarket is defined by still having a strong story. Yep. So I perceived I was serving the reader, that a metaphor should really serve the reader, like work so well that it just enhances our understanding of what you're trying to say. Yeah. Which meant I left a lot of really beautiful metaphors that were totally overwritten and like just so tragic. I was like, but it's got to go. But that means if you have a propulsive story, you don't want to get bogged down in exposition. So if you have too many months or years, that go by between chapters, you're having to catch the reader up too much and you're going to take them out of the story. But at the same time, it's spanning 70 years. So there was one time I knew it went from 1960 to 1970. And I wound up, for people who've read it, I'm not giving anything away. There's the sailing race chapter. Is what I ended up creating. And then I wound up building back during rewrites a lot around that, because you can't probably imagine taking that out at this point, because it winds up being very pivotal. So I just knew there was too much time, like 10 years, like they can't, you've got to see the kids again. And so I added that in, and then I was like, okay, this works. But you also had, so you have 1944, 1949, 1955, 1960, 66, and 70. Those are, if I have that right, I might have it wrong. There were a lot of versions, but and then in between, you're coming back to Skye, and Skye does have a big jump. She goes from 17 to 27. But I haven't heard, I never heard a lot of objections about that. And I guess it's just, I don't know why, but her story again, Marin's story is the whole family story, and Skye's story is really just hers. So,
well, I think it's because you show the parts of the story that matter. And I think that's always the good rule of thumb to does it matter to the overall narrative? And if it doesn't, it can be summed up in as little as a couple sentences of like, oh, and this was, this and this. This is so great. You mentioned you gave yourself kind of an education in these books. And you actually started a website in 2005 called greatbeachbooks.com, where you were on the quest for the Great Beach book, and Haven Point, you say, often it in many ways came out of your desire to like write your own ultimate beach book, the book that you wanted to read, as Toni Morrison says. So what in your mind makes for the perfect beach read? What are some of your favorite beach reads?
So that's such a good question. It's so funny because I had so many people. Yes, I started. It started with an email to friends in 2005, like emails, like this is all before anything, blogs or whatever. I just shot a note because I was going on vacation and I wanted to find something to read. And so people sent back such thoughtful suggestions that I was like, oh, this is great. And I just sort of put them in a document and back to everyone. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, this is so great. And then it just over time became kind of a thing. And social media, at the same time, I had all these clients that needed all kinds of, because all this stuff was so new, and it gave me a way to just sort of learn about that so I could communicate to clients. Like, it's hard to take ourselves back to like 2008 and how different things were. But the funny thing was people were like, so are you going to put your own book on the beach book list? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm biased. I never updated it this year. So the 1 year I have a book, a beach book, I didn't update my beach book list.
That sounds right.
No, good. Yeah, very clever, Virginia. So clever. Because some people were like, oh, now I know why you did that beach book list. Like I was playing this really long game.
This was the long game.
Yeah. Do you know me at all? Like, when have I ever seen past the nose on my face? I'd like to know. But anyway, the thing about this website is there's so many great influencers now for finding book suggestions, but I anonymize people's reviews. So, and I'd compile them. So if I got several reviews, I just pluck a quote from several of them, and I pick top picks every year. And then anything can be included as long as it hadn't been on lists before. So there's this huge range, and it's very searchable. So even though there's nothing for 2021 because I'm a moron and don't know how to market my own book.
Sounds like you were busy marketing your own book. I mean, like you, and also it's still summer. It's still summer. As Queen of the Beach Reads, Ellen Hildebrand says, September is still summer. So
September is still summer. So the beach reads I like I love getting just really lost in a story. And I would say that my definition has shifted a little bit. When I had little tiny kids, a beach read was one where I could put it down because someone's just eaten a pile of sand or whatever and crying, and then get right back to it. And then as I got older, and my attention span returned somewhat, that changed a little bit. I do think it's kind of funny though, this idea that people are like, well, I'm going to Italy, so I'm going to read beautiful ruins. Like, why we want to read, if we read to escape, why do we read books set on the beach while we're on the beach? Like, why don't we read them in December?
I don't know, but it's so satisfying.
Yeah. This Haven Point, yes, it's a good summer read. It's also a good October read. Also, December. There are chapters in winter in this book. You do not have to. It is not over, everybody. You can read it any old time. I'm touring. I'm going to San Francisco in November for events. I'm doing something in October.
Great.
So, now that summer is almost over, I officially reject the beach read label. And now I'm into the autumn books to remind you of the summer that's just gone by. That's what
I like it. I mean, I feel like it's just because it sort of rhyme, it's that near rhyme of beach read, like, and it's pithy and short, but it's really like coastal locales of interesting books about women that also have, wonderful aesthetic elements in it, which is, I think, a trait of all of these books. And it's certainly a trait of your book. And one thing, I mean, it's incredibly demeaning on one level that it's books about and by, not all by women, but generally books about and by and for women, which Haven Point obviously is a book about women. And it's set in a community that may be funded by the money made by men. However, it is a community that is almost entirely made up of and ruled by women, which is very typical for summer communities like this. I mean, like the idea of the summer wife. And I know growing up, my family is we have a summer place on Cape Cod, and it's mostly the moms and the kids during the week, and the dads come on the weekends, and that's very much how Haven Point was. And while relationships of all kinds, there's romance, there's friendship, there's communal, they're all in your book, but the relationships between the women are central. They're more important than the romance. They're more important. The men are almost, they're a little supporting. They're supporting characters very clearly. They do not take center stage. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to telling a story about women, and what interests you about the way that women interact with each other?
That's such a good question. I feel like there's some things that that are so much a part of us we don't even really notice them, because I honestly didn't really think actively about I want to write about women, but I went to a girls' school from 7th through 12th grade. An unbelievable blessing. Oh, did you also?
Yeah. Did you go? Where did you go?
Holton Arms in Bethesda.
Right. I have a lot of friends that went to the all girls schools around the DC area. So I was wondering.
Yes, we have. It's funny. Washington, DC, because the public schools, many of them in the city have struggled for a long time. It sort of gave rise to a lot of really good independent schools. And Holton Arms was just very empowering. The motto is Latin for "I will find a way or make one," which is a sort of
love that.
Yeah, like hello, like cry me a river, find a way or make one. Come on. Yeah. So I think I just had cooked in this fascination that, again, I didn't actively think about with societies or communities that are ruled by women, and girls' schools are like that. And I went to Vanderbilt, and I was there a long time ago, and it was a very different place. Like, it was a lot more. People now are like, you went to Vanderbilt? I'm like, oh yeah, check out what the admissions rate was when I went there. It was not quite what it is today. But when I was there, 2/3 of the students came from 10 southern states. And this is important for a reason. I come from Washington, D.C., which at Vanderbilt, when I was there, was the North. Yes, there are a lot of people, I'm in Maine right now, and everyone's like, Washington, D.C. is the South. But I'd been in this girls' school for 6 years, where every president of every club is a girl, every captain of every team is a girl. Yep. And it's just so cooked in, this idea that, and I remember I would be in class, and there would be young women who were, in their small southern schools, might have been valedictorian or salutatorian of their class, and they didn't speak in the classroom. And I was like, what? I mean, I couldn't. It was something and this just goes to the blessing and the incredible privilege of my education, that I just couldn't even understand that. Yeah. And so I think I've always had this fascination with, what happens when girls or women are in charge. And it's good, it's bad. Like, the idea that this is, women are better or worse or anything is, of course, absurd and simplistic. I think it's just interesting because you see how they interact. And I think the best example on Haven Point, again, without giving away too much, is there's a character who has a drinking problem, and the people who care about her there have despaired of her ever, resolving this. Like, they don't, and really, they're right, but they want to protect her from humiliation. And so they kind of band together and have sort of a system worked out where if someone sees her, someone else gets her out of trouble, make sure the men don't find out. And they just sort of minimize how often people see this woman in a completely drunken state, which she is very often. And they protect her, but they don't tell everybody, because some people can't be trusted with that. And I think, we all have to see the world that way. Like, we can have different kinds of friends, or people you might play tennis with, but you won't tell your deepest secrets to. Exactly. And this community has a lot of, all the organization in these summer communities, as better than anyone, having grown up with a house on the Cape, they're very matriarchal, and born of often desperation of the mothers. It's different now because there's so many more working women, but really the history of all of these is in Maine, they were Boston summer communities, and same with the Cape, and the men were, as you said, working during the week. And so you have ladies auxiliaries and all the camps and all those other activities were almost always instigated by the women because they wanted their kids to be busy. And so
who doesn't? Like, come on.
Them to do. So it's interesting. And I've never really had like broad strokes. People talk about even women candidates, and I'm like, yeah, I love seeing women do well in the world. Like, that's my whole life has been about that. But I'm like, what is that woman candidate? What is she for? I'm always more interested in substance. So we don't make huge broad brush generalizations because we're all very complicated. But I do think there's something interesting about a society that was mostly put together and is mostly run by women. And how do they get around the men also? Because they kind of do in a lot of ways.
They do. And I do. It's so great. And again, as you said, they're not, this isn't a women are better or worse or anything, it's that women are people, right? They're good and flawed and complex, just like everyone else. Like we're all people. We are all, which is such a hard concept, it seems, for everyone to grasp. But so you have all these great, I do want to just talk about the great characters for, we're running out of time. As Julie, our producer, put a little banner down. If you have questions for Virginia, please enter them in the chat. I know there are some from before, so I'll try to go back and get to those. But did you have a favorite character? We've got Marin, Skye, Pauline, Annie, Georgie, Adrian. Did you have anyone that you like totally fell in love with in your book? Like any of these women like that holds a special place in your heart, or are they all equally? I'm sure they're all equally, in there, but did you have anyone that was really especially fun or
Adrian was the sleeper hit for me.
She's fun. She's great.
Adrian was great. And Adrian represents, so for people who haven't read Haven Point, Adrian is Skye, the younger characters, our younger protagonist's best friend. And she serves a really specific function in Skye's life, which is that she is just by nature it isn't that she's non-judgmental in because she's really quite she's got sort of a sharp tongue and a sharp wit, but she's fascinated by people who are different, by anything that's different. Like she just thinks it's interesting, and she loves analyzing everything and chewing on everything. So I didn't want Skye's best friend to be someone who was like, oh, it's okay, because I thought it worked better for Adrian to be a model to Skye for just how to shift from being ashamed to seeing her life as hey, that's a really good story. My mom is a hippy dippy ding dong art teacher who teaches at all these really incredibly progressive, sometimes bizarre schools that have turn it into a funny story. And they're both very funny. And so it sort of not only serves to destigmatize Skye's life for her, to help her shed some of the shame, and also teach her, the way Skye sees it initially is that she's learning how to communicate and kind of getting ahead of people's judgment in a way a comedian does. Hey, I'm laughing too, and I'm laughing before you do. What's so funny about my life? But I think by the end, it's not giving too much away to say that she sees that what she was doing was really creating a more forgiving perspective about her mother, especially, who was challenged, and that she saw herself as dissembling in a way and sort of crafting, because this was all she was really doing, was taking an unconscious narrative and making it a conscious narrative and electing to show it. And in doing so, really, I think ultimately shifted her perspective on her life. And, but Adrian's funny and very confident, and she's from a very different background from Skye. She's not, there isn't a racial difference. It's hard. These communities really are to this day, all of them very homogenous. And it's very hard to know. I don't have an answer for how that can change, because it is sort of one of these inherited privilege situations where you have these families that have owned houses for generations. How do you get people interested in coming to them? But she's from a big, huge Greek family. And so she doesn't look like, she comes to Haven Point with Skye. She doesn't look like true north at all. Of course, and her reaction, Adrian's reaction to that at 17 is like, wow, I'm kind of exotic here. Like, this is awesome.
So only in a community like this.
Exactly. So I loved Adrian. I, of course, love Marin.
Yeah.
She's so solid. And that's the sort of obvious. I think that's most people. Marin's her favorite character. But again, Adrian was the sleeper, and she was important, a lot more important than I expected her to be.
They're all so great. They're all women to fall in love with. A little bit more just about, like, obviously, so one thing we haven't talked, or we kind of did talk about this at the beginning, that part of the book does also take place in DC. Sky's contemporary narrative takes place in DC, where she's working on the staff of a congressman. And she, you delve a little bit. Obviously, you have a background in politics, so it makes its way in there a little bit. How do you think your background, has affected and influenced your writing? How do you think working in, the political arena and in marketing and communications, how do you think that influenced you as a writer?
I think this idea, I sort of alluded to this earlier. I think just I guess horror is putting too strong a word to it, but it is really distressing to me, having sort of come of age in politics at a time when, I'd be in the green room with one party chairman chatting with the staff of the other party chairman. Like, it was so much more collegial. And I know everyone talks about, how the way it used to be, as if, and we all romanticize, like there's a book about the 1950s called The Way It Never Was, because we do tend to gloss things over.
Absolutely.
But I do think there is a strange intolerance, and I think social media absolutely has exacerbated it, which is that we have, and also sort of the disintegration of the media model, because I worked in media relations in a lot of my work. And so, we had different incentives. Incentives now are clicks, and it's sort of led to this outrage economy. And it's caused this idea I was referring to earlier about unconscious narratives. I think what people do, you see a tweet and it says something outrageous, and it's on the other side of whatever issue it is. And people's minds go to, that's what they think. It's like, no, that's what that person, who might be a Russian bot for all you know, that's what that person thinks. Or that's what that person who's having a really bad day is saying they think. And in an hour, they might be saner than they are right now. But then we begin
but the damage is done, right?
The damage
at
is
that
done,
point.
and then it's the pattern seeking. We're pattern seeking all the time. And we really think we know people on the other side. And just, I've been steeped in so many different cultures. I live in a very blue county, a very blue state. I've had friends. I lived in Boston for many years. I lived in the South. I have dear friends in the Midwest. And in California. Like, I am exposed to people who have different points of view, and I know how damaging and how awful this is. And it's just been troubling. And so I think the message for the political time, even though this is not at all a political book. I mean, Sky has the job, she works in politics, but she's super agnostic about politics in general. And in fact, she has the experience of being mystified because the staff in this congressional office, this happens, is like blindly loyal to the congressman, who's really a scuzzy guy. And she's like, what? She can't even understand that. But I think there is a message for the political time, because this novel is about seeing people and communities in all of their wholeness. And there are very few pure villains in Haven Point, or pure good guys. It's really more about, none of us are pure villains or good guys. Well, there's probably a few,
maybe some. There are a couple. I can think of a couple.
Serial killers, or whatever. Like, I'm outside of mystery, suspense, and thrillers. Like, I think it's good to just try to remember and to remain conscious of the need to understand that you think you know someone, and you often don't. And that doesn't mean you trust them, with your that you hand over your finances to some sketchy guy or to whatever it might be, but just to try and be a little more nuanced in how we see one another and just stop encouraging this, because we're all getting served up stuff we already agree with. We're so underexposed to other people's perspectives. And that's what the characters in this novel, in so many different ways, in communities, inside Haven Point, outside, how they saw each other as individuals and as groups, just really important. Even Harriet, who really is as close as you get to like a pure villainess, like she's just not a villainess, like that's sort of a strong word, but like an antagonist.
She's an antagonist for sure.
But there's even a little moment of redemption with her and a couple towards the end. Like that's, if you look for him, I think you can find that in everyone. We're in a very unforgiving age right now, and I'm really troubled by that. And so to the extent that this novel was doing anything, it was just maybe reminding people just to take another look and to maybe ask yourself that question I referred to at the beginning of this interview: what am I missing? What is it I don't know? And let people fill in the gaps a little bit.
I love that. I usually ask what you hope readers take away from your book, but I think you just beautifully answered that in that question. So last question, just because we're running out of time. This has been so wonderful. Everyone, please follow Virginia on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and say hello. Obviously pick up the book. Obviously pick up Haven Point, preferably from an independent bookstore. Virginia, do you want to give a shout out to an independent bookstore near you or somewhere local?
Yes. Well, in DC, Politics and Prose is my wonderful independent bookstore. And I'm in Maine right now, and Longfellow Books here in Portland is a terrific store. And there's also, if you're in Nantucket at all, there's Mitchell's Book Corner, which is a wonderful store. So please, yes, if you can, help our independent bookstores. They've had a hard time. Jenna, this has been a great conversation.
I love it. I could talk to you forever. Before we go, what are you working on right now? Can you tell us a little bit? It sounds like it's another Haven Point located book, which I love. I love a book that brings another dimension. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So I'm working on I guess you call it a prequel. It's I wouldn't say it's Haven Point's origin story. It's more how Haven Point got its name. And I'm going to use that darn 1895 chapter if it kills me. So it takes place that there'll be 3 interwoven narratives, because I don't know how to make things easier for myself. And the present day of the novel is 1895. So
yay. It's going to be so great. Gilded Age. We're going to do it up. I love it. Virginia, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to our producer, Julie Gerstenblatt, and to my new, actually, I can make a little bit of a lit chick announcement that we're going to be joined by another host. I'm adding a co-host we're adding a co-host. Our dear friend and author, Alex Hoops, who has been running our socials, is going to come in. She's the rom-com expert. So she's going to be doing a lot of the rom-com authors coming up in the fall, which is going to be so exciting. So she and I will both be doing interviews from here on out. But I'm going to take a couple weeks break just because I am going to try to finish my own novel. To all of those of you who have been watching all summer, it's been so fun and I've loved it. And this is such a great way to end the summery, not that we're not going to keep reading books set in coastal communities, books set in the summer. We're going to keep it going, especially books like Haven Point. Thank you all for being here. We're going to take a break next week, but we will be back the week after, and we will be announcing our lineup for the fall very soon. So be on the lookout on A Mighty Blaze on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook for all of that. And thank you all for being here. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you. So